Hi, I'm Malika Bilal filling in for Femi OK, and you are in the stream. Today, Venezuelans going head-to-head over their country's future. We'll examine the roots of the current unrest there. With me is guest digital producer Julio Ricardo Varela, who's keeping track of all things social media regarding Venezuela. Julio, I know this is something you've covered for a long time.
Very long time.
And this weekend,
yeah, this
you
weekend
were quite busy.
I was very busy, and I call Venezuela the third rail of Latin America in terms of a topic that really generates passion and opinionated comments from, you know, the right versus the left, the root causes of the protest. You know, what is going on social media? We're going to get into that, and our community has been extremely active. And I'm going to share a couple of tweets just to top it off. And I'm going to share what Halim is saying. And Halim talks about, don't forget the Chavez revolution is one of the downtrodden rebelling the elite. This is all about the elite trying to fight back. Then from B9 Ace says, he actually he was highly supportive of the protesters. And now because they support opponents of any government, but now he's claiming that the protesters are lying to him. And finally, Camila talks about the fact that Venezuela is very divided, both sides out of control, but opposition is responsible for most of the violence. So remember, you can join this conversation too. Just tweet us with the hashtag AJStream.
Well, joining us on set is George Ciccariello-Maher, an assistant professor of political science at Drexel University. He's author of We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution. George, welcome to the stream.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thousands of Venezuelans have taken to the streets in rival demonstrations, both aimed at shaping the country's political future. Recent anti-government protests are calling for the resignation of President Nicolas Maduro. Many citizens cite a worsening currency crisis, inflation, crime, and food shortages. But the president's supporters say protesters have been encouraged by outsiders and so-called fascist elements looking to destabilize the country. Last week, the rallies took a violent turn, with a pro-government demonstrator and 2 student protesters killed. 1 police officer also died. Both sides blamed the other for the violence. Over the weekend, President Maduro and opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez called for peaceful demonstrations, yet showed no signs of backing down. So what's the way forward in Venezuela? Well, to discuss this, we have 3 guests via Skype in Caracas. Emiliana Duarte Otero, a blogger with the website Caracas Chronicles. Isabella Picon is an activist who's been following the protests. And Mauli Morales is an advisor to the president of Venezuela's National Assembly. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to all of our guests. But Emiliana, I want to start with you. You were one of the thousands who took to the streets to voice your complaints. Give us a glimpse into what everyday life is like, your everyday life, that led you out to the streets.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be on this show. Any opportunity to shed light on what's happening in Venezuela, given this media blackout that we're currently suffering, I see as a privilege. I think the first thing that needs to be said is that we are currently not living in a democracy in Venezuela. A democracy is not simply just having elections or several elections year in and year out. A democracy needs to be supported upon a free press and respect of human rights and separation of powers. And I think that, I mean, it's clear to anyone who lives in Venezuela that not only does the government have control over every single institution of government, but also promotes violence outside of the institutional means. And that's what we're seeing right now in the protest, is armed paramilitary groups, which the protesters, 2 of them were killed because of them, that are being actively promoted and lauded by the government.
Well, Emiliana, you said something that I know is going to get some pushback, that we're not living in a democracy. But what I'm missing is that sense of what is happening on the ground that made people go out to the streets. I know you were telling our producers ahead of the show that taking a trip to the grocery store results in having to take a trip to another grocery store. Tell us about that.
Or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9. I mean, I wrote a post last year about trying to make a cake and the fact that I had to go to 10 different supermarkets because every ingredient took 2 or 3 trips to different stores to get. And this is me trying to make a cake. Now imagine a mother having to go to different stores just to buy milk for her children. And having to wait in long lines. I mean, Venezuelans have become accustomed to waiting in long 3, 4, 5-hour lines just to get basic goods, basic staples like corn flour to make arepas, or milk, or sugar, or chicken. I mean, we've devised creative ways of letting people know through social networks, you know, when the next shipment of this or that came to the supermarket. The minimum wage right now is a little over 3,000 bolivares, which the black market is $40 a month, which is just ridiculous if you consider that Venezuela has been receiving its highest windfall of oil income over the past 10 years, and we have the highest oil reserves of any country in the world. So it's just you'd be hard pressed to understand why there's such a disconnect between what the government claims and we're actually going through.
We actually have a video that came in from a student in Venezuela, and I just want to share it and then ask a question to George. But let's listen to this from Alexander, who will share this video with us. Once I bring it back, there we go.
My name is Alexander, and I'm currently living in Caracas, Venezuela. I am a student and a soon-to-be father. The situation in Venezuela is that the insecurity has awakened my country into rebellion against the government. The president has ordered to shut down the media and put behind bars every student who expresses themselves out on the streets. And the Venezuelan army shoot to kill or beat up very badly the people who go out and express themselves on the streets, while the president does nothing. All we need is peace.
So George, we got this video from a student protester. How accurate is that description? Or I mean, I know you've talked about this in the last couple of days. So what do you think?
Well, I think that video is a good sort of example of the real hyperbole that's driving some of these opposition protesters into the street. Namely, the idea that there's an order to arrest everyone when actually, you know, a number of students were arrested. The vast majority have been already released. The idea that, you know, there's no democracy, as Emiliana suggested, which is a kind of bizarre fringe perspective that nevertheless is driving what's going on in the streets in Venezuela right now. What we're really seeing is the sort of surging of a very far right-wing element in the Venezuelan opposition, which doesn't represent all of the students in the streets, but which nevertheless is the element that has never recognized elections, that has always said that they were always fraudulent, despite the fact that they were recognized by all international organizations. And so in other words, you've got this hyperbole that's driving it. You see it on Twitter, you see it on Facebook posts, and it's really led to a lot of the heightening tension that's going on today in Venezuela, which isn't to deny that these economic situations and the difficulties are not true, but scarcity is something that's gone up and down. It's got many structural causes that need to be worked out, and that the government has been struggling to deal with in reality. Insecurity is a powerfully important question in Venezuela, but it's kind of strange, as a lot of people have pointed out, to respond to insecurity by going out into the streets, by burning, by throwing stones, by attacking public buildings, and by even showing up and also showing up armed and shooting at the police. And this is something that's happened especially in the parts of Western Venezuela. So, you know, it's a question of really focusing on the reality of the situation, the real conditions.
I'm sorry, there have been no armed students shooting at the police. That would just to characterize these students who are only armed with their protests and their calls for safety and the government to take care of crime. It's ridiculous to claim that it's the students being blamed for the deaths of, oh, by the way, this policeman who got shot is Juancho Montoya. He's a member of a collective, a colectivo, who the Minister of Prisons, Iris Varela, said was a member of Are the Colectivos and also lauded them for being a part of the revolution. So the government has no qualms admitting that it's arming paramilitary groups that act on behalf of the revolution of the government.
Well, you mentioned the word colectivo. Mauli, I want to go to you for a definition of what that means for our international audience who may not know. Who are the colectivos?
Well, colectivos are groups that support government, Venezuelan government, and they are like in the west side of the city. They are like in the poorest neighborhood of the city. But I think that's misunderstood about this blackout that the other girl said, because I think there's no blackout at all in Venezuela, because Leopoldo Lopez, who was on order to arrest him, is talking about Twitter, you know, what they're going to do. He's calling to people to march tomorrow and join him to the Ministerio Público to enter himself, you know. He's like we're going to keep fighting and all these things from Twitter and Facebook and for the media. I don't think there's a blackout at all, because if there was a dictator here, you know, he couldn't do that. He couldn't talk to people through Twitter and Facebook and all these networks.
Yeah, but the reason why he's taken to Twitter is precisely because all other TV channels have either been forced off the air or are actually forced to exert a high degree of self-censorship, because they're faced with enormous pressure from the government to not represent what's going on. And I think a perfect example of that is Colombian channel NTN 24, which was taken off the air, yanked off the air with no previous warning whatsoever, because it was the only channel that was covering the left.
That's not a Venezuelan channel. You know, Venezuelan channels work a lot and very well, and they're not close at all. So you cannot say it's a blackout because a Colombian channel is not working in Venezuela. That doesn't have sense at all. You know.
Well, I want to bring Isabella in here, because I can see her nodding her head as the two of you talk. So Isabella, you were at the protest. You were actually at the one on Wednesday when it turned violent. Give us your view from the streets.
So George said that the protests were inherently violent in a way, that the students were fascists, and that they were violent. I was in the protest on Wednesday, the 12th, which is also Youth Day for Venezuela, and for the opposition always does like a very symbolic thing on Youth Day. 2 years ago, we did the Venezuelan the opposition primaries. 2 years later, we're doing we were doing a youth protest, in part because the students had been protesting for 2 weeks, and some of them were imprisoned for reasons that no one knows, and there was no one knew what was going on with them. So the students went to the Ministerio Público, as Mauli said, to tell the government, please let the students come out, because they were not armed. What the difference is that maybe the students become violent sometimes, and a very minority of them, and they take stones, but they do not have guns. The three people that were killed on Wednesday were killed by gunpoint, and they were killed by people from colectivos, or even from people from police forces, from state police sources. Actually, Nicolás Maduro said yesterday that the SEBIN, which is the Bolivarian Service of Intelligence, that he said to the SEBIN, it's like the FBI in Venezuela, he said to the SEBIN, stay home, stay in the barracks. And he said that the SEBIN had disobeyed his orders. So basically, he's not in control of what's going on, and that is George asked why people were protesting and what was the purpose of telling Maduro to leave. There are two reasons why people protest. One is to tell Maduro to leave, and the second one is to protest about social and economic and security conditions in Venezuela. But the thing is that because we don't see the government doing actually anything to actually solve the security problem in Venezuela, that's why people become desperate and tell, and say, I cannot allow this to last until 2018.
So we're actually getting tweets about the conditions in Venezuela and also about the media blackout. And I just want to share a couple of points here, because then kind of talk a little bit more about it. So Fatima actually tweeted, she said, I went to the supermarket with my aunt when she was in Lebanon, and she took pics of flour and milk to tease her friends in Venezuela. So there's this talk about the conditions, about not getting basic staples, but also talking about the issue about social media and media blackout. Jorge says social media has been the only source of information given Maduro's censorship and the complicit silence of Latin American media. And then also Taylor says social media began as a grassroots students and is finally asking bigger questions. So we're talking not just about Maduro versus the opposition. And finally, this is probably one of my favorite tweets of the weekend, Luis Marentes, who says, wonder to what degree each party is preaching to the converted. No dialogue, but tweet past each other. So my question for Emiliana is talking about the opposition, the social media blackout. It seems like there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of allegations, and people are like Luis says, are talking past each other and not with each other. Why is that so? Why is that happening in Venezuela?
Well, I think to a certain degree, this promotion of violence and, like I said, the fact that the government controls what you can and cannot watch on TV and the information that is being communicated amongst Venezuelans. There's a reason for this. I think violence is convenient for the government because it draws attention away from the big issues that need to be addressed, such as crime. Last year, over 24,000 Venezuelans were killed, were victims of violent homicide. Crime and the food shortages. Not only is it milk that people tease us with, pictures of milk and sugar, but also toilet paper, and just the fact that there's no opportunities and that wages are so low, and there's such a horrible economic crisis going on that's not being addressed by the government. So I think that the violence is very convenient to draw away from its negligence, from the government's negligence.
Well, George, I want to take this a little bit wider picture and looking at the justification of the protests. We've heard, of course, the varying reasons that people are on the streets. But one of the things that I noticed over the weekend among the social media, the tweets, was that are protests the way to do it, or is it elections? And elections aren't for 5 years, so that's a long time. But is this a battle between, street action and action at the polls?
I mean, on the one hand, it certainly is. Bear in mind that there have been 2 elections in Venezuela during the past year, and both of them have gone in favor of the Chavistas by small margins in different ways. But the reality is, you have a sector, as I said, who is unwilling to recognize these elections and is instead choosing the street. Now, it's important to note that this represents a division within the opposition forces, and that the presidential candidate in April, Enrique Capriles, is actually pulling back and suggesting that people not take the route of street action, as is the Mood Coalition. And you have these other actors surging forward who are definitely much further to the right and who are much more radical in their willingness to confront the state and to really put a bunch of students out as cannon fodder to further their aims. I want to just really quickly, if I can, this question of the media blackout. The vast majority of market share in Venezuela in terms of television still goes to private media outlets. And what's happening is that some of these media outlets are choosing a more responsible perspective, as did Global Vision very recently when they released a communique saying, listen, we're not going to take sides in this conflict. We're going to do journalism. We're not going to do yellow journalism, and because of that, of course, this has been very frustrating for the extreme elements of the opposition.
Well, Isabella, I heard you trying to chime in there. Go ahead.
So, do you know the concept of self-censorship? Because that's part of what's going on in Venezuela right now. After the elections, after April 14th last year, which were elections that I totally call into question. Globovisión, which was the main opposition channel, changed owners, and since then we basically don't see our leaders on TV anymore. So that's the reason why we seek Twitter, that's why we seek YouTube, that's why we seek Facebook. There's no other way of listening even to the mainstream leaders, even Capriles, who you say is more level-headed.
Global Vision was purchased by another group of private investors. I mean, I would think that the opposition, with its celebration of free market economy, would celebrate the fact that Global Vision has changed hands through a free market exchange. And so now, just simply, they have fired
journalists that are the ones that voiced the opposition's causes the most.
The radical fringe.
While students were being killed on Wednesday the 12th, Globovisión was transmitting a cooking show. That's what you saw during the protests. Globovisión was forcibly sold to interests that are operating privately and their interest of the government.
And 70,000 people were 70,000 people protesting in Caracas. And that's not news.
So guys, I'm going to bring a little bit of the community in. I'm going to bring a little bit of community in, and then I want to direct a question to Maoli. But we're getting a lot of Facebook comments from actual Venezuelans on Facebook, and I want to share a couple. This one is from English Room and says, when a country has a good president, its people don't go to the street. Protests don't turn into bloodsheds. Students aren't shot. People wouldn't keep risking their lives in a rally if they were happy with their situation. Also, there's talk about Isaac, who talks about, I would like to see Maduro admit to mistakes he's made and not blame everything on the U.S. and work with opposition leaders. And finally, the opposition, and this is Halim back, says the opposition uses rumors and the Venezuelan mass media as weapons in their fight to create chaos and discredit Maduro. So for Maoli, talking about what President Maduro has said about that this is part of this oligarchical conspiracy coming from the United States, what proof does the Venezuelan government have about these type of allegations? considering what just happened in the last 24 hours when there were American consular people that work for the U.S. Embassy that are being expelled from the country?
Yeah. Well, Maduro says that because opposition traditionally has take not constitutional way of protesting, you know. I think all the world has seen, and you just broadcasting right now, a video where the opposition march turned violence, you know, and that's always has been like that. When Chavez was in the government, it was the same thing. So I think they have a really good, a really confrontational strategy, and that's not going to work because we are in democracy, because we elect the president, because there were elections almost every year in Venezuela. So we are in democracy. If they have an issue or a difference with the government, the way out is not getting stones and destroy buildings and destroy streets and, you know, get violence. I don't think that's the answer for our problems, and they are doing that. So I guess Maduro has said that because Altamira is destroyed. It's a neighborhood in Caracas, and it's destroyed by the opposition, and they blame Chavistas about it, but they don't recognize her blame, and they marched on Wednesday, and there were 2 people killed, there were 2 people assassinated, and they say it was Chavistas, but they don't recognize they march the thing. The organization is very violent, and they destroy Altamira, and the mayor of this neighborhood said, "Oh, guys, you have to think what you're doing. This is the way to get out of our problems, or you're just being violent."
Well, Emiliana, speaking of what Mauri is saying, Emiliana, speaking of what Mauri is saying, the way to get out of our problems, you know, earlier we heard George mention the split within the opposition. You have Capriles, and you also have Lopez, who we mentioned a little bit earlier, who actually went out, did a video, which I pulled up on my screen here, gave a video just yesterday calling people to come to the streets for a protest tomorrow on Tuesday. So we have this apparent split in the opposition. What's next? Does the opposition have a plan, or where do you hope this will go?
Yeah, see, that's a mischaracterization of what's happening within the opposition. Capriles was the first one to tweet out support to Lopez, as did Maria Corina Machado. There might be differences in criteria as to what the content of the protest might be, but all members, and Maria Corina and Leopoldo, who have been characterized in this show as being far right, are just as members of the opposition as Enrique Capriles, our last presidential candidate. And they've all expressed their vision that protests are legitimate, constitutional, and complementary to other means, such as the electoral ones, of confronting the government. And just a little bit, just to round out my point about the media blackout, El Nacional is a nationally circulating newspaper, and today it was forced to come to press with only 8 pages because the government, which controls the dollar, we have a strict exchange control in a discretionary manner, chooses to withhold the dollars needed to import paper so that this paper can go to print. And that's just one of the many indirect ways in which the media is being asphyxiated in Venezuela. And with regards to Mauri's point about the elections, those elections were neither free nor fair, not only because the government controls the media. Maduro was on television last year for 259 hours in a national compulsory communication throughout all radio and TV outlets.
Well, Emiliana, as you said that, George chuckled, which means this is great fodder for the post show. But before we go, I know our community's been all over this.
They've been all over it, and I just want to share one closing tweet.
Please
talking
do.
about the future of Venezuela. And this is Ruben, who says, "We want to work together, not against anyone. We just want to see our people to find solutions for next generations."
So we'll talk about some of those solutions, possible solutions,
right,
in the post show. But on the next show, we find out what real-life absurdities inspired a new Kenyan mockumentary on NGO culture. Stay with us. The post show on Venezuela is next. It's streamed at aljazeera.com. Julio and I will see you online. Welcome back. This is the Stream's online post show. We're talking about the current political tensions in Venezuela. Let's get back to the conversation. Just before we headed to the post show, George, you were chuckling at something Emiliana said. Go for it.
Well, it has to do with this question of the media blackout again, and this returning to the idea that somehow the media is pro Chavez, pro Maduro, and against the opposition. And we should keep this in historical context and understand that it wasn't the political parties necessarily that led the coup against Chavez in 2002. It was the private media. They'd become this sort of power in their own standing and participated directly in the overthrowing of a democratically elected government. Luckily, that coup was reversed. But since then, of course, the Chavistas have said, well, wait a second, what is going on with the media and what can we do about it? And so there have been laws, there's been discussion of how to insist that people have a right to accurate media while not impinging unduly on free speech. And so, but it is of course a difficult task. But the question is, at what point does it become irresponsible, like yelling fire in a crowded theater, to publish misleading things in the media in a way that the goal of which is to call people to the streets, as happened in 2002, and to seek la salida, the exit of a democratically elected government. And this is what's been most disappointing for me about Twitter, especially being in the United States, is that a lot of people, because they're excited about the Arab Spring, they're excited about the Indignados and Occupy, they see anyone wearing a mask and protesting, and they think that this is someone who's on their side, and so they uncritically retweet things that are really the worst hyperbole and exaggeration.
It's funny you talk about Twitter, because Twitter is, whatever you say about Venezuelans, Twitter is the place to go.
Right. And he mentioned the hashtag La Salida.
La Salida is one of them, but
many.
you know what we did? We actually looked at all the trending hashtags the last couple of days in Venezuela, and I just want to do a quick run through of them because they're literally divided. Right. So from the pro-government, you have Somos Ejército de Paz, which means we are a peace army, talking about the peace rallies. We have Pueblo de Paz a la Bolívar, which is country of peace. And making reference to Simón Bolívar, the great liberator.
No, I'm sorry, that's Avenida Bolívar. That's the street.
Oh, the Avenida Bolívar, that's right. And then you have SOS Venezuela, which is actually a very common opposition hashtag talking about basically Venezuela being in trouble. And then Reportero NTN 24, which talks about the Colombian blackout of the media. And then Leopoldo está en mi casa, which is Leopold is literally in my house, meaning that a lot of Venezuelans are talking about, well, if you're going to arrest Leopoldo, arrest me. So my question goes to Isabella. And Isabella, social media has become sort of a central, very viral part of this entire dialogue. When you talk about a media blackout, I would hesitate to say that there's a social media blackout. But could you admit that at least both parties have been sort of at fault here for sending inaccurate information? It doesn't seem like it's like there's examples of pro-government and there's examples of opposition showing those images. I mean, and looking at the critical eye of all this, don't you think that that's part of the problem?
Okay, so the opposition is adjusting to a new situation, which is not even having like one channel where your leaders are interviewed, where you can know what's going on from like your part of the conflict. So now we have to get our information from the internet, and sometimes people retweet and tweet pictures that has happened, that are from 2002. The other day, even the government was putting on national TV a march from 2009, and we are in 2014. So it happens to both sides, and it's part of learning how do you deal with, with a media blackout. But what is true, and we're talking about like how can we solve problems, is that Twitter is not the way really to talk to the other. To talk to the other, you have to go to their field, and most of Venezuela is really not on Twitter, and that is the truth. But it is one of the only ways in which you can actually get information, because the mass media is not giving everything we need.
Can I just add something to what was said before in agreement with Isabella? So not only do you have a government that controls most of the media outlets, they control over 700 radio and television channels throughout the country, but also the state media channel, which is a huge apparatus, is just exclusively dedicated to communicating propaganda and government-sponsored. It's basically a party affiliate. It's the communicational arm of the PASUV, which is the government official party. And so if the whole point of this self-censorship is to not promote irresponsible violence, then why is Venezuelan Televisión, which is the government's main channel, dedicated 24 hours to inciting hatred? I mean, if you turn on Venezuelan Televisión at any moment of the day, there used to be a show that got turned off, it was on the air until last year, whereby they would just call people names. I mean, it was dedicated to vilifying, insulting, humiliating, intimidating, and threatening.
So, Emiliana, you say that
voices.
These channels have been inciting hatred. As you were speaking, George was shaking his head. Mauli is shaking her head. Mauli, I want to go to you for your pushback to that.
I'm sorry, what? I cannot hear.
She was just mentioning, Emiliana was talking about stations on the air that she says were contributing to an atmosphere of hate. What's your pushback?
Well, I think she was saying about government is control all the media, and I said in Venezuela it's 4 main channels. In Venezuela are 4 channels. One of these channels is BTV that she was saying is the channel of the state, of the government, and the other 3 are channels that are private and they are opposition. So I think there's no blackout of what she's saying, and I think there's a lot of hate in Venezuela, but there's a lot of hate in two ways. One is a hate of class, people who's like always being good and hate poor people, and poor people who's hate this big class that has discriminated them a lot and for all time, you know, since always. So
these divisions are completely promoted by the government.
You just have to let me talk, and that's one way of violence. And the other way of violence is impunity. You know, there's impunity here in Venezuela, and that's a way from people from opposition turn violence because they know government is not going to do anything. You know, opposition leaders are all in the streets. Leopoldo Lopez has an order to arrest him, and he's on the street right now. So really permission with these people, and they do whatever they want. So I think in Venezuela is a lot of impunity for government and for opposition, and that generates violence because people say, well, I can do whatever I want and justice is not going to get me, you know.
So Mauli, I'm going to bring in a couple of community, and I actually have a question for George, and this, we're hearing a lot about specific solutions, you know. And this one from Mr. Dramas, who I love, great Twitter handle, says the Venezuelans should look for a Venezuelan solution to the Venezuelan problems, unite for a common course. And no matter what, there is this general theme about, here's a picture from one of the protests that says, not more deaths, no más muerte. So, George, I mean, what are the Venezuelan solutions that need to get discussed so that we get beyond what we're hearing here in this discussion? You know, it's one side against the other. Like, what would you suggest?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that there actually is a Venezuelan solution to this problem, namely, and you can see it in the fact that when Enrique Capriles ran against Nicolás Maduro, he was saying, I'm not going to roll back everything Chavez did, you know, because what Chavez accomplished cannot be denied by even much of the opposition. In other words, there's a vast majority of Venezuelans that see a path forward through what has been provided already by Chavismo. Now, this requires, of course, dealing with crucial questions. Insecurity is a massive question. I wish we had time to get into the complexity of it, but historically the police were a problem. Historically, they caused a lot of violence, and historically the colectivos that Emiliana was criticizing so much emerged as a way of the community to defend itself against violent state-sponsored police. And so and it becomes very difficult then to confront crime when the police
violence? What would you say to the tenet that the state should have a monopoly on the use of violence, on the use of force?
I think the state has an effective monopoly on the use of force. I think there are colectivos, of course, that have weapons and have historically had weapons, but this doesn't make them into the sort of the image, the hateful image that the opposition likes to paint them as. This is really the bogeyman of the Venezuelan opposition to say, these are these violent colectivos, they're not allowed in Altamira, and so we'll tweet out pictures every time we see anyone in a red shirt.
You know, what you just said just sparked a little firestorm among our Skype guests. But we're running out of time, Mauli. I hear you. We're running out of time, unfortunately. So I actually would like to get one last word from all of you. And looking at the way forward, Julio read a couple of tweets saying what some solutions could be. So I'd like to hear your solutions. George just gave us his, and with a little look back at some history. Mauli, what is the government response to the reasons that people took to the streets?
Yeah, I think the government is going to dialogue with opposition as opposition stays in the way of democracy. As they became to stay in violence and destroy everything around, government is not going to sit to dialogue with opposition. I guess the opposition strategy right now is very wrong, and they have to reflect that and keep on moving on democracy to the strategy they want to get. You know, they want to get out Nicolás Maduro. Well, you have to go to elections. You cannot get him out of government just being in the street and being violent. That's not the way. That's not the answer.
Well, Isabella, elections are 5 years away. What do you want to happen up until
Elections
then?
are actually 2 years away because we have parliamentary elections in December 2015. But I would say that elections are 2 years away, and in the Constitution we can change the president not only through elections or through presidential election, but also by referendum. And they should see it as a possibility. And because we don't have elections in the next 2 weeks, in the next 2 years, we are gonna be protesting, and the government should get used to people protesting, you know, and the opposition is gonna get used again to protesting on like very specific issues: violence, insecurity, impunity. I'm very glad Mauli said the thing about impunity. Very glad. Socioeconomic issues. I think you should get used to the fact that we're gonna protest on very specific things, very peacefully, and that way is how we're gonna solve things. Well, thank you.
Thank you. And Emiliana, your prescription for what Venezuela should do?
Well, I think that the government's calls for dialogue are absolutely hypocritical as long as they don't become accountable immediately with regards of the 2 deaths of the students that are supposedly currently in investigation. But you know, they have to. It's the state's job to guarantee the safety of all citizens, regardless of whether or not they're voices of dissent. And I think that people's constitutional right to protest should be absolutely respected instead of persecuted and criminalized. And I think only then can we even begin to remotely speak of dialogue, because when you have a president who uses state resources to go on TV for hours on end to insult and vilify and humiliate, you know, you have a very disproportionate equilibrium, you know, of power and access to institutions. So.
You know, Malika, that last theme about, you know, resolving things peacefully has been resonating throughout the community. And I'm just going to close with a final tweet from Gary, who says, "This is definitely a scary situation. Hope it can be resolved peacefully and with no more lives taken."
Thank you for that. And of course, the conversation will continue online as it always does. But thanks to our guests here today, George Ciccariello-Maher, Emiliana Duarte Otero, Isabella Picon, and Mauli Morales. Now, on the next show, we find out what real-life absurdities inspired a new Kenyan mockumentary on NGO culture.